She smiled when the lawyer took off his glasses and cleared his throat, the kind of slow, self-satisfied smile that made the room feel smaller. "Your dad left you nothing, boy," she said casually, not looking at me so much as at the reflection of herself in the blank TV across the conference table. The blinds were half closed against a gray afternoon, dust turning in the slice of light, and the leather chairs made that whispering sound every time anyone shifted. I didn't. I was holding my father's old watch under the table, the one that needed winding every couple of days, the one that ticked loud enough to be heard in a room like this. I held on to the steady, stubborn rhythm of it. The lawyer, Mr. Halperin, flipped to the last page of the will and paused in a silence that made the air feel heavy. When he finally looked up, his eyes went to her first and then to me. "There is one more line," he said. That was when her smile froze and my fingers tightened around the watch until I felt the glass press a small moon into my palm. I used to joke with my father that he built his life out of things other people threw away. He took a tired machine, a door that wouldn't close right, a house sagging at the back porch, and worked until it remembered what it was supposed to be. He ran a little renovation outfit from a squat brick workshop behind our house, the kind of place that smelled like motor oil and cut pine in equal measure. On mornings before school, I'd follow him out there in socks, shivering, watching the white steam of his breath mingle with sawdust motes spinning up in the thin light. He'd wind the watch, his father's before him, with a twist of thumb and forefinger, hold it to his ear, and say, "There, Daniel, still keeping time." Then he married Claire. He met her at the counter of the hardware store, where she wore a name badge and the kind of lipstick that leaves a crisp mark on a paper cup. She was funny when she wanted to be, cool when she didn't. I can't say she was cruel at first. She was interested. She'd stand in the doorway of the shop with a coffee and laugh at the way my dad cursed softly when a board split. She started putting catch-all trays around the house, white ceramic dishes that said keys and mail and coins, as if the objects themselves needed reminding of their place. My father, who used to leave screws embedded in the bottoms of cereal boxes and pencil stubs on the washing machine, began to empty his pockets into porcelain. The house got quieter. The little clicks and clatters of his life were trained out of it. It was a relief to me, at least at the beginning, to see him happy with someone who smelled like expensive soap. We tried for ordinary. We watched the Sunday game with bowls of popcorn, her legs tucked under her like a practicing ballerina, her laughter bright when my father's team missed by inches. But small things shifted, the way floors sink under a refrigerator. My father began to eat earlier so she could keep her kitchen clean. He stopped taking calls from old clients after 7 because she said, gently at first, that evenings should be for rest. And when I told him I'd been accepted to a community college program for carpentry and design, she smiled without showing teeth and said, "Oh, honey, I thought you'd do something bigger." By the time my father's cough became a diagnosis, the dishes labeled coins and keys were always full, and the watch started losing time. He told me it just needed a new mainspring and a proper cleaning, but he kept wearing it because routine felt like hope. He let me drive him to appointments in the hospital's concrete parking labyrinth, and I would sit on the edge of the chairs in waiting rooms where the magazines were a season out of date. Claire was efficient. She learned the nurses' names. She color-coded his pill organizers. She once told me that if I was going to visit, I should bring practical things, like hand lotion without scent and socks with grips. She wasn't wrong. She just didn't look at him the way he looked at me, when I unscrewed the cap of the lotion and worked it into his hands. The palms that had lifted beams and framed walls, and touched my face when I was small enough for him to toss me up and catch me, laughing. He died in a cold month when the maple at the edge of our yard looked like a collection of thin scars against a white sky. The funeral was short. It was the right kind of short. People who knew how to stand in silence came. The men who used to work for him stood together in their too tight jackets, their knuckles rasped and clean. After the last handful of dirt hit the box, Claire put her hand on my shoulder, nails light, and said in a voice you could write in a sympathy card, "We'll get through the logistics, sweetheart." The logistics began the next morning. I woke to a half-changed house. The framed photo of my father and his favorite flannel had disappeared from the mantel, replaced by a print that said in gray letters, "Live simply." The list she had made during the week, watery blue ink and neat squares, suddenly migrated to the center of the kitchen. It had bullet points like bank utility, title, and at the bottom, a new one, workshop. "We should clear it," she said. "It's clutter. It's a fire hazard." She was still wearing black. She was already barefoot. I told her the shop could wait. I said I needed to be in there. I watched her smile, sympathetic and immovable. "We can't live in the past," she said. "It's just stuff. It wasn't. It was the smell in my father's collar. It was the bent nails he saved in a jar because he would never waste something that still had a bend left in it. It was the little brass key he kept on a separate ring, the one I'd asked about 100 times, and he'd said, "For when I'm not around to tell you. You'll know." I went to the shop when she left for the bank and locked the door behind me. I sat cross-legged on the concrete floor and cried into sawdust that scratched my knees. Then I stood up and started looking. The watch had stopped that morning. The second hand was stalled on the 9 like someone taking a breath, and then deciding not to say it. I opened the back the way my father had taught me. Pressure for Nathaniel, and a thin folded paper slid into my palm. It was just the size and shape of the watch's heart. His handwriting unraveled across it like a line of fishing mono. It said, "If they ever you I left you nothing. Look under the middle floorboard by the bench." And there it was. The joke tucked into the ache, if they ever. If they. That if was a door he'd built for me inside the worst day of my life. The middle floorboard wasn't even nailed. He'd used a snug tongue and groove. The kind you can pry up with the edge of a chisel if you know where to lift. Under it was a shallow cavity in a flat tin that had held sewing needles once, the kind my grandmother used to pretend to thread without looking. Inside the tin, wrapped in waxed paper, was a bank envelope, the old kind with a string that winds around a round, brown button. Inside that was a safe deposit box key, brushed dull from handling. There was also a second note. Not his handwriting this time, but the lawyer's typed letterhead with a line in black ink for the reading. I didn't tell her. When she asked later that afternoon why there was sawdust on my jeans, I said I'd knocked a broom against a beam. She nodded like the answer had met a requirement. Then she told me, with gentle gravity and a softness that belonged to someone who had apparently always meant me well, that there would be a reading at Halperin and Ross on Friday. "You should come," she said. "It's important to show face." The phrase clanged in the empty spaces of our kitchen. Between that Tuesday and Friday, I learned more about the physics of grief. It is not like water. It does not settle at the lowest point. It's more like electrical current, looking for any ground. Some of it ran through my phone at night when I reread the messages from my father. "Pick up more screws. Call Eddie about the fence. Proud of you." Until the letters blurred. Some of it shocked me when I caught my reflection doing one of his gestures, the tilt of the head he used when pretending to consider a question he'd already decided. And some of it gathered, slow and charged, around the key I kept in my pocket. I took the bus to the bank on the far end of town, the building with the old tin ceiling and the clock that always read 5 minutes fast. The clerk looked the number on the key and nodded and asked for identification and a signature on a line. The room with the boxes was quiet as a library. When the metal drawer slid out and the gray box lay in my hands, I didn't open it there. I want you to know that. I had learned from my father not to do private things in public. I signed their paper, took a breath, brought the box to a side room, closed the door, and then I opened it alone. Inside was not money. It was something more expensive and less liquid, the deed to the workshop and the small rectangle of land it sat on, which my father had quietly extricated from the house's original parcel and put in his name alone 12 years earlier, a binder labeled employee agreements, a thin USB drive in a plastic sleeve, and a final sealed envelope with my name. My hands shook. The envelope smelled faintly of cedar, the way his closet did. When I broke the seal, a short letter slid out, dated 6 months before his diagnosis. "Danny," it began. "Half my life ago you showed me how to loosen my grip on a thing without dropping it. I don't want you dropped. I don't want the men I've promised work to dropped either. So here's what I built while you weren't looking. There's a trust that takes care of the shop and the people attached to it. There's a clause that forces kindness, which you will hear Friday. The USB is proof. Halperin has the rest. Don't hate people you don't understand. I've done plenty I don't understand. But don't let anyone tell you your life is smaller than it is. When the watch. Keep your hands open. Love, Dad." I sat there and stared his name at the bottom as if the ink were still drying. The room hummed with the bank's old ventilation, and somewhere down the hall a door clicked. "Forces kindness," I whispered, and felt foolish and then angry and then like maybe I knew what he meant. The nights before the reading were an education in pretending to sleep. The house felt occupied by someone else's idea of mercy. Claire moved quietly, her hair wrapped in a pale scarf, her feet silent on tile. She spoke in low tones on the phone to her sons, who called less since the funeral now that the casseroles had dried out and been thrown away. I overheard their voices once when she stepped onto the deck. "We'll be fine," she said, and there was laughter on the other end. "It's all arranged." She came back in and wiped the counter that didn't need wiping and caught me looking. "It's just how I cope," she said. Cleaning. I nodded. I didn't tell her that cleaning has a sound, and that what she was doing made none. Friday arrived in a bright, indifferent sun. We took separate cars to the law office. Hers was new, mine was the truck my father let me drive when he was too tired. The truck's seatbelt frayed from decades of winter coats and heavy tools. When I pulled it over my shoulder and clicked it into place, I felt something like an embrace and something like being tied down. Halpern and Ross sat in a building that tried to look like a smaller version of the courthouse, and succeeded only at being expensive. The receptionist's hair was shellacked into a shape that would survive wind, and I loved her for that. She asked us to wait, and we took seats opposite each other like polite opponents. In the conference room, there were 4 glasses of water, as if a ghost had been expected, and there were 2 of Claire's sons already seated, both wearing suits that had memorized their bodies. They nodded at me without quite looking. Mr. Halpern greeted us with careful warmth. He was a small man who had aged in place, with a tie whose pattern had never been in style. He gestured for us to sit and spread a folder open like the sun spreads between curtains. He began to read, and the sound of his voice was both too calm and entirely correct. It was nothing dramatic at first. It was all the things a life needs to say when it is stepping out of the room, a line for each of us. Acknowledgements. Legal sentences that curled back on themselves for safety. My father left the house to Claire, with a life estate that, the lawyer said, meant she could live there until she didn't want to or couldn't, after which a residue would come to me. He left small sums to his sisters, whom I imagined crying into paper napkins in kitchens dotted with magnets. He left personal items to be distributed as Claire saw fit. She squeezed the back of a chair in a gesture meant for cameras. Of course, she whispered. Then my father's voice, in the formality of legal ink, shifted. There was the workshop parcel separate, with its deed already in the trust named for a bird he loved when he was a boy, the kestrel that hovered and then dove with the audacity of a much larger creature. There were instructions for the trust, to fund wages for the 3 men who had worked beside him most consistently. Eddie with the tattoo of a mermaid around a forearm that looked like a foundation wall, Louis, who taught himself trigonometry with string and plywood, and Mr. Garvey, who had called my father Kid until it inverted and became endearment. The trust would pay out regardless of whether I continued the business, for 2 years, under a manager they named if I refused. It was both more generous and more controlling than anything I had expected. It was exactly like my father. Claire cleared her throat. Is that necessary? She asked in a careful tone. The wages, I mean. If the business is dissolved, the trust contemplates that possibility, Halpern said. There are funds allocated. But now I must reach the clause that has conditions. Her smile was back, smaller now, as if trying to fulf into a size appropriate to an afternoon in a law office. Conditions are fine, she said. We all loved him. He loved you. Halpern agreed. He also loved his son. He turned a page, slow as a Sunday. Somewhere in the building a photocopier wheezed. My father's watch ticked under the table, brave and loud. Pursuant to Article 8. The lawyer read, the bequests and life estate to my spouse, Claire Hart, are conditioned upon her continued demonstration of kindness toward my son, Daniel Reed, and upon her not obstructing his access to his personal property, tools, and the workshop. Any alienation of his person, exclusion from the family home within 6 months of my death, or misrepresentation to him of the contents of this instrument shall constitute a breach, and shall render these bequests null, vesting instead in the trust for the benefit of Daniel. All the air snapped tight into the room, as if a plastic bag had been pulled around us. Claire's fingers, which had been resting lightly on the table, lifted and settled again without finding the surface. I don't understand, she said. These words. There he wouldn't. There is more, Halpern said, his voice careful but not unkind. He anticipated that this clause might be challenged. He requested that, if certain assertions were made to Daniel in the period following his death, we should take note. He lifted his eyes to me. He left a message, he said softly, for a circumstance in which his son was told he had been left with nothing. He asked that if that statement was ever made. I read the final line of the codicil aloud. The Claire's smile died like a candle in a draught. There was a first flicker of confusion, a lean back, and then a stillness that felt like sailcloth going slack. This is absurd, she said, but her voice had thinned. One of her sons shifted in his chair, and then remembered that he was pretending this was beneath him. Halpern slid a single sheet out from the bottom of the packet, the page with my father's small signatures climbing the margins like little hands. He put on a second pair of glasses over the first and read the last line the way a man might speak to a friend's grave. And finally, he said, to my wife Claire, The continuance of your life estate in the home and any bequest hereunder is contingent upon your not telling my son that I left him nothing, nor acting in any manner designed to convince him he has no place in my life or house. Any such statement or act shall be evidence of unkindness sufficient to breach this clause. For a moment I could hear only the watch. Tick, tick. It had never sounded so confident. Claire made a small sound, a sort of laugh choked down the wrong way. I may have said, in grief I may have. She looked toward her sons, who became experts in the exact spot of table wood in front of them. The lawyer's face softened, but he was a man hired to be a wall in storms. We also have, he said, and I could hear the apology in it. A recorded voicemail from the morning after Mr. Reed's death, in which you asked Daniel not to attend the reading, saying, quote, "There's nothing for you, sweetheart. Your father left you nothing." Her knees moved under the table. They hit, lightly, as if she had misjudged the distance and the furniture had risen up to meet her. I watched her hand go to the edge as if to steady herself and fail to find purchase on the polished wood. She closed her eyes, opened them, and then closed them again, like someone checking a window won't latch. I didn't mean I was trying to spare you the pain," she said. And this time she did look at me. "You know how your father could be. He liked to flourish. I didn't know. For God's sake." She stood up and then sat down. There was a moment when I thought her anger would unspool across the room, a whip of sound and words. But what came instead was smaller and more dangerous. "You planned this," she said. "You and he. With your little keys and your little tests. How dare you?" I closed my hand around the key because it was easier than opening it. "I didn't plan it," I said. "He did. I would give it back if it brought him into the room." My voice surprised me. It sounded older than I was. Halperin cleared his throat softly. "There is one further matter," he said. "Mr. Reed left a file." He touched the USB in the folder, documenting the transfer of certain funds over the past year from accounts associated with the business to a personal account not in his name. He wrote that he did not want to prosecute his wife in the event of his death. He wrote that he understood how people become afraid. But he also directed that if there was any such misappropriation, it would be offset any bequests to her under this will. The amounts, I'm afraid, would exceed the value of those bequests. The room did not move. Even the dust in the half-light seemed to choose a place and hold it. One of the sons swore under his breath, a small human sound that made me pity him briefly, and then not at all. Claire stared at the water glass as if it owed her loyalty. "He told me he wanted me safe," she said hollow now. "He said he didn't know what he would leave. He told me not to worry." She looked at me and there it was finally, not attack but bewilderment. "I thought you had his heart," she said. "I never thought he would give you his mind. My father had left me both, but one came wrapped in conditions I would spend a lifetime unwrapping." The rest of the read was the orderly collapse of a house we had already watched lean. There were signatures needed and discussions to be had in future offices. There were members that sounded like oxygen to one person and like vacuum to another. There was the small mercy of the law's stiffness, which is not love and not forgiveness, but which can be, at least, a boundary. Outside, the sun had shifted to a warmer angle that made the parking lot look briefly like a pond. I stood next to the truck and rolled the watch between my fingers. I thought about the men who would have paychecks for 2 more years, regardless of whether I could hold a project together. I thought about the plank of maple we had never turned into a tabletop, because my father had wanted to wait until he could find a pair of legs that would do it justice. I thought about Claire, and how grief makes thieves of us in ways we don't anticipate. We steal time, attention, embarrassment, old photographs, the possibility of a different memory. She came out with her sons, who flanked her like polite shadows. She walked toward me as if her feet were doing the job without instructions. "I'm not going to beg," she said. "I won't play that part for you. But I will say this, your father wasn't as simple as he pretended. He took care of you in ways he never took care of himself. I tried to build a world he could live in without drowning. Maybe I held him too tight. Maybe you think this is justice. Fine. But justice and mercy never once had coffee together in that man's head." She bit the inside of her cheek. "I'm moving out of the house. I can't stand inside those walls and listen to a watch tick that isn't mine. You can take the ceramic dishes," I said, because it was the only sentence that arrived unbroken. She laughed without humor. "Keep them," she said. "Label everything if it helps." It didn't help me. Then she took a breath and said, with the last of her ammunition, "You'll fail at that shop." It was him, not the wood. You think it was you and the wood, but it was him. "I think you're right," I said. "Which is why I'll start small." The weeks after are a montage if I tell them too quickly the lists I made in pencil. Not because I am more honest than ink, but because I needed to believe mistakes weren't permanent. The days I stood in the middle of the workshop and waited for the smell to be permission. The first morning I called Eddie and Louise and Mr. Garvey, my voice too brisk, asking if they would come by at 9 sharp because I wanted to talk through a plan. We opened the big door and let the light in. I read them the part of the trust that mattered most to them. Your wages are covered even if I mess this up. Mr. Garvey cried in a way that looked like a cough. Eddie nodded and said, then you might as well try. Louis said, your father taught me how to frame a wall that wants to lean. We can fix what wants to lean. We turned our backs on the jobs that would have been too big for our hands. We took the porch rebuilds and the window replacements and the one kitchen whose owner understood that nothing in an old house will be square, least of all your expectations. I learned the hot patience of unexpected rot. I learned to step away from a joint just before it started to fight me. I wound the watch in the mornings and listened to it in the afternoons, when the shop was noisy enough to drown out everything else. I put the needle tin back under the floorboard as if it were still holding a secret. The house changed shape around me. Without Claire, it stopped trying to be a magazine picture and returned to being a place where a human being could set down a coffee mug and forget it. I kept her print for a while, live simply, because I didn't trust myself not to replace it with something more petty. But one day the paper curled in the humidity, and I took it down and leaned my father's photo back in its spot. He looks out from the frame like he has just been told a joke and is trying to decide if it's kind. I keep him there to remind me of the right question. Claire found a small apartment across town with a balcony that overlooks a parking lot. I saw her once at the supermarket in the aisle where they keep the good olive oil and the cheap wine, her hands hovering as if both were strangers who might need introduction. She turned her cart as if the wheels had learned ballet. How's business? She asked, chin tipped like someone asking about weather in a place she doesn't plan to visit. We're making things flat that were warped, I said. So better? Better, she repeated, and there was a softness in it. I kept a copy of your father's recipe for marinades. He liked meat sweet and then suddenly sharp. You should take it. She reached into her bag and handed me a scrap of index card covered in his handwriting, a list that had migrated in and out of drawers for years. She had folded it into the shape of an envelope. When she pressed it into my hand, I realized he had taught her how to fold things too. Don't let yourself turn into him, she said. Don't decide you have to do this alone. I called her lawyer and signed the papers that made her move out clean. Halperin, who had done his job like a man building a dock in choppy water, shook my hand and said, your father would well. I don't know what he would be, but he'd be something loud about this. He smiled, and it made him look briefly young. He loved you in all the ways you already know, and some you don't yet. We took on a job out at Lake Ellis, 2 doors down from a boathouse my father once repaired for a man who paid him in cash and a canoe. The air there smells like wet rope and old sugar. We rebuilt a deck that had decided it preferred the lakes company. On the last day, by accident or design, I ended up at the edge of the dock alone at dusk. The water was the color of pennies and the shape of a held breath. I took the watch out of pocket and wound it while listening to the silence that lives between ticks. I told my father the things I would have told him if he were standing there. That I had learned how to say no to a client who wanted for $200 what the world would charge $2,000. That I had cut my thumb on a planer and didn't cry. That I had found a way to look at Claire and see the person she almost was for us. I wear the watch now only when I need to remember that all movement is borrowed. It's too loud for polite rooms. But in the shop it has the right to speak up. When there's a lull in the work, when the sawdust settles, and the afternoon light lies long across the bench, someone will ask me why I keep an old-fashioned thing that needs tending. I say it is because a thing that needs tending teaches you the worth of your hands. I say it because it was something my father held that held him back. Sometimes late, after the men have gone home, and the shop is a box of shadows, I pull up that floorboard and take out the tin and hold it without opening it. Not because I think there's anything left inside to find, but because I remember the exact sensation of lifting a secret out of wood and seeing the light hit a dull brass key, and knowing as surely as I've known anything, that love can be prepared. It can be engineered. It can be a clause that forces kindness, and a last line that makes a woman's knees shake, and a paycheck that arrives when your hands are still learning what they're for. It can be the sound of an old watch not asking and not promising but insisting, little tick by little tick, that time can be used well. When I think of that afternoon in the lawyer's office, what I remember isn't her smile dying, or the way my own heart found a new rhythm. It's that I didn't have to say much. The last page did the speaking. My father, who used to hold a board in place and say, "Let the tools do the work," had done it again. He set the saw in my hands and drew the cut line for me. I followed it. The wood gave, the piece fell away. The rest remained, clean and true. And the best part is that the sound that held the room together then is the same sound that holds me together now, the steady measure of something small and old that doesn't lie, the watch, still ticking. I didn't tell anyone about the way my hand shook that first night alone in the shop. I swept the floor in long lines that made a soft hush, then rolled the broom heck back and thumped it twice against the dustpan, because that's what my father did, as if the broom needed encouraging. The watch on the bench muttered to itself, louder in the emptiness. I made tea in the rusted kettle that always adds an iron taste to the water, and I stood by the big door with the steam against my face and tried to imagine a day when the air wouldn't smell like absence. It was a thought too big to lift. So I did what he taught me: break down the weight. I stacked the next morning's tasks in my head like lumber. Call Mrs. Hollis about her stairs, check the truck's brake line, make a list for the county inspector, and I slept in the chair with my knees up because getting home felt farther than it was. The first weeks felt like walking on boards I kept testing with my heel. I expected them to split. I expected to fall through. Instead, each small step held. The trust paid the guys on time, and that took a kind of shame away I didn't know I'd been carrying. It let me choose jobs for fit, not desperation. We started saving little wins: in a coffee can, a clean miter joint, a stair tread that didn't squeak, a client who put a hand to her mouth when she stepped onto a porch that no longer tilted. I kept the can on a shelf above the miter saw and told the men it was a joke, a place to store bragging rights. But every time I dropped a scrap of paper in there with a date and a few words. Hollis Stairs perfect risey run. Garvey's idea stayed us an hour. I felt something in my chest click back onto its track. Then came the first test that didn't care about our coffee can. A letter from the county about the workshop's zoning classification. My father had filed a variance years back when the shop was just him and a kid who fetched nails. Over time, as the business grew, so did the number of complaints from the neighborhood. Noise, parking, deliveries early and late. He had handled it with a handshake and a Saturday afternoon fixing someone's fence for free. I didn't have his handshakes yet, and Saturday afternoons already had a line. The letter said we were due for inspection, and if the inspector didn't like what he saw, we'd need to move or close. I put the letter in the middle of the bench, and the men gathered around it like it was a blueprint for our own eviction. Eddie whistled low. Lewis rubbed the back of his neck. Mr. Garvey said, "We used to keep our heads down. Didn't work, but we kept them down anyway." "I'll call," I said, hearing my voice try on a steadiness it hadn't yet earned. "I'll be respectful. I'll be early. I'll answer every question before he asks it." "Bring him muffins," said Lewis. "Do not bring him muffins," said Mr. Garvey. "You bring a man muffins and he wonders what you don't want him to see." I made a list and stuck it to the pegboard with blue tape. Sweep. Organize solvent cabinet. Label everything. Put noise baffles on the wall behind the planer. Fix the exterior light that flickers like a haunted porch. I went home that night and took down my father's recipe card from the refrigerator. Claire had pressed it into my hand in the supermarket aisle, and I'd set it with reverence and avoidance on the door with a magnet shaped like a lemon. The ink had faded where soy sauce once dripped and was wiped away too hard. He'd written ingredients like he told stories. Simple, with a surprise. 2 cloves garlic, 1 thumb ginger, brown sugar, splash of soy, squeeze of lime, black pepper, and then, in his slanted hand, quiet heat. That was my father's whole life in a line: kindness, with the option of a burn if you deserved it. I read the card as if the recipe could also fix county regulations. And then I cooked. I marinated chicken the way he did, turning it with my fingers, lifting it to my nose the way he'd taught me to judge whether something had arrived at its truth by smell. I ate standing at the stove because a plate looked too formal for the way memory sat with me. The watch ticked on the counter. It was ridiculous and it helped. The inspector, when he came, was a man whose shirt button was losing its argument with his stomach. His name was Anthony, and he had the careful eyes of someone who has had to learn how to be fair while being watched by people who don't want fairness. They want favor. I shook his hand, firm but not like a contest. I showed him the solvent cabinet first, because he would ask, and I wanted to answer without flinching. We walked the perimeter. He took notes on a tablet with a cracked screen. He asked about traffic and deliveries and whether we planned to expand. "No," I said, and felt how true it was. "If anything, I want to go a little smaller. Fewer jobs. We're trying to be a place that doesn't make the street hate us. He smiled without looking up from his tablet. That's a good way to think about a lot of things, he said. He tested the exterior light switch and nodded when the bulb stayed steady. He asked if we'd had any recent complaints. Only from objects, said Mr. Garvey, who had wandered in from the yard. Boards complain when they discover they're supposed to be straight. We tell them it's the law. Anthony huffed a laugh. He tapped a few more boxes. You know you're lucky, he said. Grandfathered variants and all. Most shops your size would have to move out to the industrial park. I know, I said. We're trying to deserve the luck. Deserving luck is my favorite use of it, he said. He signed something with a stylus that left a line like a soft crack in ice. You're fine for now. Keep the noise down before 8. No Sunday deliveries. If you're gonna run the planer for more than 10 minutes. If it's hot, buy a fan. I stood in the doorway after he left, feeling a relief that landed so hard it almost hurt. Eddie smacked my shoulder twice. Louise said, muffins would not have helped. And Mr. Garvey said, man had the look of someone who eats a muffin and thinks about what else he needs to check. We got back to work, and work did its job. It took the day and filled it with measurable outcomes, even when those outcomes were, we learned today what not to do. We made mistakes that cost hours and money. I ordered the wrong size sash weights for a window restoration and ended up driving across town to trade them with a guy who bartered in antique hardware and grudges. We took on a bathroom remodel for a woman who had a list of non-negotiables that changed daily, and on a Wednesday she cried because the grout color she had selected in daylight looked like a bad decision at night. I sat on the tile with her and said, we can change it. And she looked at me like I had rescued her from a burning house. You'll change it, she said, and it came out like a dare and a prayer. Yes, I said, and I meant it and hated that I meant it. Later, when I told the guys, they rolled their eyes, and then they mixed the new grout and we did it right. Claire called once, about a month after the reading, to ask if I wanted a box of my father's things she'd found in the attic. It's mostly papers, she said. Old permits, letters, some photographs. There's a tin of screws because of course there is. She paused. I put aside anything with your name. I didn't read. Thank you, I said. We agreed I'd come by on Saturday morning. I brought her coffee not as a peace offering, but because people should have coffee when they do unpleasant things. The house had already lost the smell of her. It now had that faintly stale odor of walls waiting for instructions. She'd packed the box neatly, with a folded towel on top to keep things from shifting. We stood by the mantel where his photo had returned and looked at the way his mouth held a smile before committing to it. I don't know how to apologize in a way that would matter, she said, eyes on the frame. I don't have the words that make it clean. I know that's not how it works. But if words do anything, hear these: I loved him. In the way I know how. It wasn't enough for the way he needed loving. That's not a crime, but I made crimes out of my fear. I took what wasn't mine because I thought I could make safety out of dollars. All I did was count wrong. She looked at me then, cheeks blotching in a way I had not seen, because grief had always looked tidy on her before. I told you he left you nothing, because I thought if you didn't expect anything, you couldn't be disappointed. I forgot who your father was. He always left something. He couldn't help it. I swallowed and felt it like a piece of bread with a hard crust. He found a way to force kindness, I said. I didn't understand what that would feel like from this side. Like judgment, she said. Like mercy with a ruler. She laughed, small and not unkind. He knew exactly what would get through to me. Money I could release, but the idea that my words could make my life smaller. That did it. I'm not here to make your life smaller, I said. I know, she said, as if knowing didn't ease anything. Take the box. There are letters from clients. There's a note from the first time you stayed home with a fever and he made soup. He saved everything that made him feel like he was doing it right. The box was heavier than it looked. I carried it to truck and set it on the passenger seat and buckled it in without thinking. Back at the shop, I opened it with the same slow care you give anything that might break you and mend you at the same time. The papers were what she'd said. Old permits with signatures like dragonflies. Photographs with edges that had been softened by being shuffled through hands. He'd saved a drawing I had made of the shop when I was 8, a rectangle on triangle on top, and a door so big it looked like a mouth, with stick figures holding boards twice their height. In the pile there was also a small manila envelope, unmarked. Inside was a single Polaroid, hinting me, I am 8, scabbed knee, grinning with a gap I'd thought was tragic at the time. He is younger than I am now, hair too long at the back, arm around my shoulders, looking at the camera with an expression I had not registered as love then, because I thought love was loud. On the back, in faded marker, "We build what we can carry." I kept the Polaroid in my wallet, not because I needed proof but because I needed ballast. On hard days, it kept me from tipping toward anger that didn't earn its keep. Not every test came with paperwork. Some came with an ambulance. One Friday, 2 months into trying to hold the world up with 2 hands, Mr. Garvey slumped on the tailgate of the truck and didn't answer when I said his name. He looked like a man remembering something he wanted to tell you and deciding to tell you later. His skin did a color I didn't have a word for. Louis saw it too. He called 911. Eddie caught Garvey's shoulders when he slid and made the slowest fall of a person look like a controlled descent. The paramedics arrived with their rolling thunder of competence. They talked to him the way you're supposed to talk to scared children and proud men. They took him, and I followed in the truck, and the watches ticking in the cup holder was indecent in the sterile bright. It wasn't his heart not that day. It was his blood sugar and his pride in the heat. The doctor said he needed to stop pretending 68 is 38. Mr. Garvey stared at the ceiling and said, "What if I just work smaller?" The doctor, who had seen 1,000 versions of that sentence, said, "Smaller or smarter? Ideally both." I drove him home in a silence that was our friendship beating under our mistakes. When we got to his apartment, he refused my arm until he didn't. He sat on the edge of his bed and looked at me like I had made the day longer than it needed to be. "You don't have to carry everything your father put down," he said. "Some of it was heavy for a reason." "What do I do with the heavy?" I asked. "Invite help," he said, and then, because he is not a man who lets a moment go by without trying to turn pain into a trick, and stop putting the planer on the high shelf. I told the men the next morning that we would be changing the way we worked. Breaks on the hour. Water in the middle of the floor like we were in elementary school class. Anyone feeling lightheaded says it out loud and sits down. Nobody makes a joke at his expense. The joke will wait. And for the bigger jobs, I called 2 guys I knew we couldn't afford and told them I'd pay cash for a day when the lift was too much. They said yes because my father had said yes to them once when they were new and scared and pretending not to be both. We lost money on a job that month, a porch we had to redo, because my measurements matched the plan but not the actual house, which leaned like it had its own opinion about gravity. I sat on the floor of the shop that night and felt the dumb tug to call my father and confess. Instead, I wound the watch and told him out loud what I'd done wrong. "Don't worry," I said to the empty room, to the grain in the bench, to the ghost of him that is not a ghost but a set of habits that outlive their owner. "We'll fix it." Saying we meant I wasn't alone in it. Saying fix it meant I remembered we knew how. There are softer tests too, the ones people don't see because they don't come with flashing lights or official seals. I was in the grocery store one evening, the hour when everyone is in a quiet hurry, and I saw Claire again, this time with a man in a brown jacket who listened to her with his chin tucked down, as if keeping her words safe under the brim of his understanding. They looked like 2 people learning a new dance on the kitchen floor. I watched her lift a pair of capers and set it down again like she was adjusting a painting by a degree. She saw me. Her hand twitched, then steadied. She nodded. I nodded. We existed in the aisle as 2 people who had built a shape together, badly, but not for lack of desire to make a shape. I thought this is what mercy looks like in the wild. It's not a grand gesture. It's a nod over capers. It's the absence with a small cruelty you could have chosen. A week later, I got a letter I had been expecting in the way you expect rain, if you stare at the wrong part of the sky. It was from her attorney, a formal reconsideration of the will's conditions, an invitation to mediation, a suggestion that some of the language might be unconscionable. The words were suits. They gathered the middle of the page and tried to make themselves taller. I took the letter to Halperin. He read it with his glasses low on his nose, which made him look like a disappointed bird. "They'll try," he said. "It's their job. Ours is to remember the facts and the law and your father's stubbornness." He looked up at me. "Do you want to fight? You don't have to. We can agree to a settlement that gives her something. It might make your life quieter. It might also make it smaller in a way you regret later." I went home and set the letter under the watch and watched the second hand go reluctant around the dial. I made the marinade and let the quiet heat find me. Then I wrote Claire a note in my own hand. I told her I would not fight her in court. I told her I would also not change the will. I told her plainly that if the trust and the workshop were to do what he intended, they needed to be left alone. But I also told her I would send her a check each month for a year from my wages. Not the trust, not the business, but from the part that hurts because it's mine. Because I still believed my father loved her, and people shouldn't be punished for not being built to hold the kind of love someone offers. It wasn't penance. It wasn't absolution. It was the shape of my hand when I tried to build a bridge with boards, cut to fit our wrong angles. She didn't cash the first check for 2 weeks. She wrote back on a card with a photograph of a feather. "Thank you," she said. "This is wrong and it is right. I made your father's marinade. I added too much lime. I think he would have liked it anyway." The men teased me, gently, when I told them. "You paying 2 mortgages," said Eddie. Not unkind. One in wood and one in words. "I don't know what I'm paying," I said. "I just know what I can carry." "Keep some for yourself," said Mr. Garvey. "Don't try to impress the dead. They're not watching the way you think they are." But sometimes it felt like he was. Not the ghost story way. The way a habit feels like a hand on your shoulder. I'd go to cut a piece of oak and hear him say, "Measure the area you can live with," and I'd put the pencil back on the line and add a hair I had been about to take. I'd lift a door off hinges and hear him say, "Don't fight a hinge, be smarter than the pin." When a client tried to tell me the job was not what we had agreed, I heard him say, "Put the paper on the table and let silence be your lawyer," and silence worked when my voice would have made a mess. At night, the watch's tick sounded less like a metronome and more like a metered poem. I learned to sleep through it, the way you learn to sleep through the train line behind your first apartment. The noise becomes the security. If it stops, you wake. One afternoon in late fall, when the trees had gone from brilliant to resigned, a boy came by the shop with a backpack whose zipper had lost its certainty. He stood in the doorway like he was trespassing on a museum. "Is Mr. Reed here?" he asked, voice cracking on the Mr. "You got him," I said. "Which one you want?" "The one who used to come to the high school to talk to the shop class," he said. "The one who showed us how to square a frame with a string." "That was my father," I said. "He died." He looked down at his sneakers and then up again, the quick up, and down of someone reworking his plan. "I'm sorry," he said. "I had this idea and I thought he might listen. I want to apprentice. I don't know if that's a real thing anymore. I work after school at the corner store. I can sweep. I can fetch. I can be quiet. I can also not be quiet if you want." It wasn't the right time. We were barely keeping our own corners swept. But the watch ticked in my pocket. I remembered the line on the Polaroid, "We build what we can carry." My father had carried me into this life because he knew his hands would be here when he wasn't. If I said no out of fear, I would make my life smaller in a way I'd regret. "What's your name?" I asked. "Marcus," I said. "Show up Saturday at 8. Wear shoes you don't mind ruining. Bring a notebook. I'm going to talk a lot at you and none of it will make sense until it does. You'll be paid in the satisfaction of sweeping correctly. We will get you real pay if you don't disappear." He showed up at 7:40. He swept badly for 2 hours and then perfectly for 10 minutes and then badly again. He watched the men the way a hungry person watches a kitchen line. He held nails like they were coins minted in a country with rules he wanted to learn. He asked questions that made me remember the exact moment, years back, when my father explained the difference between level and plumb, and my brain rewired itself around a center line. We took him to Mrs. Hollis's for a small job she had forgotten to ask for, the way people forget small pain once big pain leaves. She poured us lemonade and told Marcus he was lucky to learn from men who looked like they knew where they put their feet. Marcus nodded solemnly and then tripped on the threshold and caught himself on the door jamb. He laughed. So did we. Something in the day forged itself into a permanent peace. There was order winter when the power went out in my neighborhood, but not at the shop. A storm had snapped a line somewhere between the hill and the river. The house got cold. The refrigerator breathed once and died. I wrapped the watch in a sock and tucked it into my shirt like it was a living thing that needed my warmth. I went to the shop and started the propane heater and lay on the floor with my back to the bench and listened to the roof tick with the contracting metal. The kind of quiet you can only hear in a storm sat with me. I thought of my father asleep in a hunting cabin once, telling me that the sound of a building flexing is not a warning but a language. It's saying I'm still here, even as the wind suggests otherwise. I said it too, to no one and to everyone, I'm still here. The watch answered in its roundabout way. When the lights came back on the next day, I made coffee in the kettle and felt like I'd earned it more than on days when it simply appears by habit. I found the tin beneath the floorboard and held it, the way I do sometimes when I need to be convinced. The brass key, with its edges softened by the number of times I've thumbed it like a charm. It doesn't open anything now. The bank box is empty of surprises. But the key in my hand is a choice you can hold. Every time I press it into my palm, I feel the wooden corridor of that day, when everything rearranged around a last line in a lawyer's office, and a man's decision to define kindness in ink. Spring came on like relief pretends to be bravery. We got a job painting an old church whose cross had been down since a storm. The pastor was a woman with shoulders like the top of a ladder. Deliberate, not decorative. She paid on time and brought us sandwiches and asked me once, as if in passing, whether I felt like my father was proud. On some days, I said. On the other days, I just hope he's busy with something else and not watching me measure twice and cut wrong. He is not watching, she said and smiled. He is being proud in a place where time is not like here. The usefulness of a father's pride is not that he will applaud every choice, but that he handed you a mirror that is kind. Hold it up when you're mad at yourself. I wanted to ask her to write that down and nail it to the wall. Instead I said thank you, and she said you're welcome, and the day kept doing its job. The mediation never happened. Lawyers like schedule more than they like conflict, and the calendar won. Claire's attorney wrote again to say they would not pursue, that she had decided to accept the will as written, that she wished me well. At the bottom, in a line that probably wasn't supposed to be there, the attorney added, she asked me to tell you she's sorry she told you your father left you nothing. She says she understands now that he left you a list. He did. It is written in pencil because it is not finished. It has lines like call Mr. G about railing and teach Marcus the string trick and buy fans before we need them. It also has lines that look like I stole them from a church bulletin. Remember who you are when no one is watching. Keep your hands open. When the watch. On the first anniversary of his death, I took the day and refused to fill it. I went to the lake where we'd done that deck, and I sat on the dock with my legs dangling and my boots untied, because he hated untied boots, and it felt like a small rebellion he would permit today. I brought the marinade on chicken in a paper bag and cooked it on a small grill until the sugar charred just enough to count as flavor. I ate with my fingers. I wiped them on my jeans. I said his name out loud, because names need being said to stay strong. A couple walking by smiled like I was having a picnic with a ghost and they were fine with it. The watch ticked against the boards. The water made that quiet slapping noise against the posts that sounds like someone agreeing with you without words. I thought of the lawyer's office, that light with the dust in it, the suctioned silence before the last line. I don't replay the moment of her knees betraying her to feel big. I replay it because it taught me a law I can live with. Truth doesn't shout. It waits. It knows its page as the last one, and it will be read when we're out of patience and ready to listen. Later, when the sun was working on being something else, I packed up and drove out to the cemetery. I don't go often. He isn't there, not in any way that asks for my presence. But the stone has the dates, and the dash between them is the line I'm writing with a pencil. I set the watch on the top of the stone for a minute, hearing it clatter softly like a toast. We're all right, I said. We're not good and not bad and not anything you would have a better word for. We're all right. On the way home, I stopped by the house. The new family had moved in, a couple with a toddler who tumbled across the yard like a slow meteor. The maple had leaves the color of argument. I watched a moment and then kept driving because that chapter doesn't need me as a character. I passed the hardware store where my father met Claire. The same bell still rings on the door. I went in and bought a box of drywall screws I didn't need and a pencil I did. The clerk didn't wear her lipstick like a proclamation. She wore it like a habit. I liked that for her. Back at the shop, the men had left me a note on the bench. In Eddie's blocky script, boss. 2 boards for Hollis. Bring string, ask Marcus about school. And in Luis's neater hand, we are using the good drop cloths tomorrow. Not the ones that smell like history. And in Mr. Garvey's shorthand, close the big door when you turn on the planer. Inspector's ghost watching. They had drawn a wobbly watch in the corner with the hands at a little before 6. Because that's when we clock out and stand leaning on the truck saying nothing for a useful minute. I wound the watch. I listened. I slid the forward back into place and pressed my palm on it until the wood felt like skin warmed by sun. I turned off the lights and stepped out into the air that still held a little heat. I locked the door, then unlocked it to check I hadn't left the kettle on, then locked it again, because caution is love wearing a boring coat. I stood there with the key in my hand, the one that doesn't open anything but the past, and I felt its shape imprint itself in my palm. Tomorrow I would teach Marcus why you don't trust a board that promises to be straight for free. Next week I would say yes to a job I didn't know how to do yet and find the people who do. In a month I would send the last check to Claire and feel the complicated relief that would bring. In a year I would read the first line of the coffee can and remember how we had saved ourselves with scraps. On the way home, the traffic thinned like a sympathy I didn't require. I rolled down the window. The dusk made everything the same color for a few minutes, which is when the world looks most honest. At a red light, I glanced at the passenger seat where the Polaroid had slid from my wallet and lay face up, him and me, the shop door behind us like the mouth of a story. I picked it up and tucked it back, a ritual without magic that still made me feel protected. When I got in bed, I took the watch off and put it on the table with a small, respectful clink. Its face glowed the faint way watch faces do when they've stored up a day's light and are willing to give it back in narration. The house was quiet in the correct way. I could hear the refrigerator hum and the distant suggestion of another person's laughter through a window I had forgotten to close. I closed my eyes and saw a lawyer's hand, an envelope split clean, a room holding its breath. I saw my stepmother's smile turn into something human. I saw my father build a clause like a wall and a door and a path all at once. We say people leave us nothing when what we mean is they didn't leave us what they left someone else. It took the last line of a will and a watch that insists on being tended to learn the difference. When the morning came, the light touched the face of the watch, and it gave the light back, steady as ever, and I did the thing I have done every day, since he could no longer do it himself. I reached for the crown between finger and thumb, and turned it until I felt resistance. Then I turned it 1/4 more, the way he taught me, not enough to strip the threads, just enough to honor the spring. Time lives in that quarter turn, in the choice to wind when winding feels like work, in the promise that nothing precious runs on its own. If you want it to keep, you keep it. And if someone tells you there's nothing to keep, you listen to the last page, you lift the board, you find the key that doesn't open a door so much as it opens your hand, and you hold out what you found to the room until everyone's faces change. Then you put the thing back where it belongs and get up the next day and do the beautiful, boring work. Because that's what he left me, and it's not nothing. It's everything that matters, ticking.